1, 2. Test 1, 2. Check 1, 2.
That's recording. Yes, okay.
This is Tracy Galville. Good afternoon, Secretary and Commissioners. Starting out with the State Racing Fund statement, beginning of the month it had a balance of $6.3 million. Total revenue was $1.5 million. Expenditures were $1.5 million, leaving a cash balance of $6.3 million at the end of the month. The Racehorse Commission financial statement, total revenue was $700,000. Total expenditures were $554,000 for the month. Testing, the transfer amounts were $816,000. Total expenditures were $961,000. Promotion, there was no revenue, and there was expenditures of almost $26,000. The comparative financial statements, the revenue is off, it appears to be down, mostly because of the non-tax revenue that occurred in 16-17. I'd have to research to see what that was, but it's significant. That is the most significant part of it. And operating expenditures are up. Again, that's the timing of the UPenn payment. It's mostly responsible for that. And then behind that are your individual restricted fund statements.
So 2 questions. One, any surprises?
No, there's no surprises. It's pretty standard. I mean, it's really made it a lot easier this year with the fact that we had last year to use as a comparative basis. So it makes it a lot easier to look at the financial statements and find out, you know, if there's anything out of line. And we're coming in close to where we anticipate. Again, budget's based upon spending authority, so we try to overstate that so we don't run out. But the budget's right on target. We are working through the re-budget right now, but I didn't have to make any changes to the racing fund.
So, always helpful to explain the re-budget.
Okay, so we have a budget submission, just to go real quick through this. In the fall, we put in our request for 18-19, which starts July 1st of 2018. After that, then the governor puts together his proposed budget, which comes out in February. We typically then, after June 30th, when all the expenditures are in, do a re-budget, but they're trying to do an early re-budget again this year. If you remember, we did this last year. So we put in our re-budget, and that's due Tuesday. And then there'll be another re-budget when the budget's enacted. It's gotten to be crazy. It really is. And we had talked about, we're in the middle of an IT HR consolidation. Those expenses came back much higher than we had anticipated, but because we did your budget based upon spending authority, you have a high enough dollar amount budgeted for your admin billing. So you're not having any changes to your budget at all because we had that in to allow the spending authority. So your budget will, at this point, go back in exactly how you approved it. We're not making changes this year. Now, as last year, we will talk about it in July, the amount of which will be transferred to, the cash balance. That's done as of June 30th. So in the July meeting, we'll be discussing that, the transfer amount. But that's the process we really have here. And it'll be handled the same way. If the full amount is not needed for testing, they'll do that budgetary reserve like they did this year. So I think we've got our process down here. But I think the governor's determined to have a budget on time this year, and so that's why we're trying to get in front of this.
Tracy, thank you. Other questions, comments on the March financials? Let me get a motion. We have a motion to accept the financials. Commissioner DeLunder on motion. Commissioner Lara on the second. Discussion. Question, Brian?
Yes. Tracy, I see here that we're like $6.3 million to the good so far with 2 months left, approximately to the end of the year. Are there any ideas on what will be left at the end of the fiscal year to be carried over? for
No,
next
I'll be
year?
honest with you, we haven't even looked at that. We've been so focused on trying to get this rebudget done because unlike other years, we've had a substantial amount of rework. Did that, got different numbers 2 days ago, had to redo it. So we haven't done that yet. I would think that starting here at the end of this month, we would start projecting that. As far as the commission's a little easier to do. So I mean, we can take a look at it and give that to you at the next meeting, a proposal. But again, I hate to really do that, then if something comes through and changes, you know, but if you're following it through, and I accidentally put this one, I guess, on the bottom.
Brian, we'll get back to you next
Yeah,
month.
I think, like I said,
I just,
you'll be,
well, but, you know, fine.
it won't be as large as last year, we can tell you
No,
that.
we know that.
Just so we can clarify that again. But
I think the key point of your statement was we're sort of one budget, right? So the reasonable projections we laid out, so if you look at that budget today, it's pretty accurate. It's tracking to where we are in the year, right?
Right.
So, okay, good. We have a motion and a second. Further discussion? If not, all those in favor of accepting the March financials as presented, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, say aye. Motion carries.
thank you.
Thanks, Tracy.
Next up, we've got a presentation from the PMGI Group concerning their purchase of a metals racetrack and casino. I'd like to call upon John Finnemore, Chris Rogers, and Chris McElhenney.
Good afternoon. As we get seated here, I'll get started. My name is Michael Fabius from the law firm Balance Barrow, representing Penn National. As we seek your approval of the change of ownership in the Meadows. We're excited to be here before you today. Remarkably, Penn National started about 46 years ago as a single racetrack here in Pennsylvania. It has grown to become the largest racing operator in North America and one of the largest gaming operators. Even after all this growth, Penn National continues to be headquartered here in Pennsylvania. Its crown jewel property is in Pennsylvania, in Grantville, Penn National Racecourse. And we're excited to be able to have, once again, 2 racetracks in Pennsylvania. As the commission may recall, now a little while ago, we used to own and operate Pocono Downs as well, but with the legalization of the casino side, they put in place a 1 license limit that's now been lifted. So we're very excited to be here. With me is immediately to my right, John Finnemore, Senior Vice President, Regional Operations. To his right is Chris Rogers, Vice President, Deputy General Counsel, and Chris McElhenney is farthest to my right, and Vice President Racing. Also with me today is Frank Donahue. We will speak off of a slide deck that I believe was already distributed to everyone in the room. If anyone does not have it, I have additional copies. We'll try to work through in the time that we have just a real quick overview of the transaction with Pinnacle, the strategic rationale, what the new combined company will look like, briefly the financing that's in place to complete the transaction, and I think what is most important, the impacts on Pennsylvania racing. So with that, I'll hand it off over to John.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, good afternoon, commissioners and staff. Turning to page 4 of your deck, I'll briefly walk you through a transaction overview. As I believe you know, this transaction of Penn acquiring Pinnacle Entertainment was announced in December, on December 17th of 2017. The total transaction value, this is inclusive of debt, is approximately $2.8 billion before divestitures, and $1.9 billion net of those divestitures, and we'll explain those to you in a moment. Pinnacle shareholders will receive, as part of the deal, $20 per share in cash and 0.42 shares of Penn stock for every Pinnacle share owned. Obviously, in each case, it will be calculated on a shareholder-by-shareholder basis. The rationale for Penn to complete the deal is really a pretty simple one. Pinnacle and Penn were the two dominant players in the regional gaming markets nationally, and Pinnacle had locations in states that Penn did not have a presence, so it made a lot of sense for us. We'll explain that to you momentarily. We'll show you a map of the U.S. where all the casinos and tracks are located. So it really enhances Penn's position as the leading regional operator in the sector. It increases our geographic diversification, as I mentioned earlier. It exposes us to, for instance, to states like Louisiana, where Penn currently doesn't have operations, or Colorado. Increases our footprint in Nevada. Again, it's very complementary to our current portfolio. It also allows us to acquire really best-in-class assets. The Pinnacle assets are very high-quality assets. They operate a lot of resort destinations, full resort destinations with spas, extensive food and beverage offerings. So it's again, very complementary for Penn in that regard. And again, I think it's just, those of you who know Penn, and as Mike said, we've been doing business in Pennsylvania a long time. It's been really a great growth story for this company over the years. A lot of you watched the company grow significantly, and this is just the next step in our growth. Turning to the next page, this map of the country really gives you a snapshot of the combined company, the locations, again back to the geographic diversity or diversification. And on the right-hand side, you can see that this will be the company once the deal closes, starting with 41 casino properties or total properties, which, by the way, is now 43 with the 2 Category 4 licenses that Penn has bid on and will be opening. So that 41 is actually 43. By the way, that includes 13 horse racing operations. My colleague Chris Mackerling will give you some detail on that. But we operate Thoroughbred and Standardbred facilities as well as dog tracks, 13 in total. 20 jurisdictions, 53,500 slot machines. We will be the largest slot operator in the country, not just in the regional markets in total. 1,300 tables, 8,300 hotel rooms, and I think most significantly, over 30,000 employees. I've been with the company almost 16 years. And when I joined the company, we had less than 5,000 employees total, so it's a significant company.
Excuse me, when I joined the company, there were 3 employees. I was controller while they were building the racetrack out there.
Okay.
He beat you.
Yeah, definitely beat me. With that, let me turn it over to Chris Rogers, who's our General Counsel.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So I'm going to start by talking about the structure of the operations of both Penn National and Pinnacle Entertainment in Pennsylvania. You can see by the structure chart on slide 7, structurally the 2 entities are very, very similar. You have publicly traded companies on top with intermediate holding companies that act as the tenant under the leases that both casinos and racetracks have with Gaming and Leisure Properties, Inc., which is a separately publicly traded REIT. And then under that you have the operating entities, which include the racing and casino licensees. As part of the transaction, Pinnacle will be merging into a newly formed subsidiary of Penn, and as a result will become a wholly owned subsidiary of Penn. So you see on the next slide, slide 8, the resulting transaction structure is pretty straightforward. You're just taking the Pinnacle, all the Pinnacle entities, and you're really moving them over into the Penn structure as with Pinnacle being a direct subsidiary of Penn National Gaming. So when we looked at doing this transaction, there were a couple things that we knew from the very beginning were going to be challenges. One of them was that although Pinnacle did have access to new markets where Penn currently didn't have exposure, we knew there was going to be some overlap. And specifically, we knew there were license limitations in 3 states at that time. Indiana, Ohio with the racinos, and at that time, Pennsylvania. in Pennsylvania, as you recall, had the limitation on the 1 1/3 live casino license. So for that reason, we were expecting to do divestitures, required divestitures in those 3 markets. Plus, we had identified Kansas City and St. Louis as markets, although not technically required by the statute. We thought from an FTC perspective, it was likely that divestitures would be required. So we were looking at 5 properties in total as planned divestitures. We decided at the very beginning that it didn't make sense to run auctions for these on a separate basis. We didn't want to do that. We wanted deal certainty. We wanted a partner that we knew that could be licensed readily in those jurisdictions, who was an experienced operator, and had the balance sheet to be a good partner for us in the transaction with Pinnacle. We identified Boyd Gaming Corporation as that divestiture partner, and we entered into negotiations with them fairly early on during our negotiation process with Pinnacle as a potential divestiture partner. When the Expanded Gaming Act happened in Pennsylvania, one of the real benefits for us was it gave us the opportunity to own the Meadows in addition to Penn National. And so for that reason, we went back to Boyd and said, I know we talked about divesting to 5, but now we can keep Meadows, so how about 4? And that's what we ended up doing. So the 4 divested properties are Belterra in Indiana, Belterra Park in Ohio, Ameristar in Kansas City, and Ameristar St. Charles, which is in St. Louis. So one of the benefits of doing these divestitures was that it would give us cash back from Boyd that we could use to fund the consideration to the Pinnacle shareholders. So that ended up being one of our sources of capital to do the deal. In addition, we had 2 properties that were not subject to a lease with Gaming and Leisure Properties, Inc. One was Plain Ridge in Massachusetts. The other was Belterra Park in Ohio, which was owned by Pinnacle and not subject to the lease at the time we did our transaction. So we, at the same time, entered into an agreement with GLPI where we would sell the real estate for those entities and lease them back. And that became part of the proceeds that we would use to fund the consideration. In addition, we had standard debt financing and a significant amount of cash on the balance sheet of both companies. So both Penn and Pinnacle generate a lot of free cash flow. And the period between signing this transaction, which was December of last year, and the closing, which will be sometime in the second half of this year, we expect to generate a significant amount of cash flow on the balance sheet, which can be used as part of the consideration to the Pinnacle shareholders. We also entered into an amendment to our credit facility that would recognize the fact that we are a much larger company, generating a lot more EBITDA with a lot more free cash flow, and it permitted us to increase the amount of senior secured debt we could have under our existing credit facility. So when you look at the next slide, you see the anticipated sources and uses for this. It's a big transaction, but when you break it down by components, it's actually quite manageable. We're looking at new debt financing of about $1.25 billion. We are using our stock as part of the consideration in the transaction, which was really important for us for a couple of reasons. One is it allowed us to reduce the amount of debt we needed at closing, so from a leverage perspective, that was really good. The second is it gives an incentive for the Pinnacle team to really to benefit in the upside of the transaction. During our negotiations with them, John didn't mention this, but this whole thing actually started when Pinnacle approached us and said that they would like to buy Penn. That started a series of negotiations that went on for almost a year before we finally signed a definitive agreement. During that period of time, we sort of decided early on that if a transaction was going to occur, it would be with Penn as the buyer. However, we had the typical negotiation on purchase price and what purchase price made sense. Allowing us to introduce Penn stock as part of the consideration really helped us close the transaction with Pinnacle, because they recognized early on that there was a lot of synergies and a lot of upside from combining the companies, and by giving their shareholders some of that upside through Penn stock, they would be able to benefit from that as well. So that is one of our sources in this transaction. You see that listed at $756 million. We are also getting approximately $850 million for Boyd for the divested properties that I mentioned, and then expecting around $180 million of cash on the balance sheet, which will be used to fund the transaction. You can see on the right-hand side that those proceeds will be used to pay off the existing debt, to pay the shareholders the cash portion of the consideration, as well as to pay the not insignificant transaction costs associated with this transaction. I'll turn it over to Chris to talk more about racing.
Thank you. Good afternoon. As you've heard a couple times already, the history of Penn National is intertwined in the horse racing industry. Since 2007, when I joined the company, the racing operations have grown from just 5 properties to 6 acquisitions during that time frame in 5 different jurisdictions. Right now we have 11 racing properties across the United States in 9 different jurisdictions. That's the most of any operator in North America. And with this transaction, 2 pinnacle properties are racing facilities, the Meadows outside of Pittsburgh, and Retama Park, a thoroughbred racetrack outside of San Antonio, Texas. With those acquisitions, Penn National Gaming will be operating nearly 1,500 live racing dates annually, and close to $1 billion in parimutuel handle at our facilities. The 1,500 racing dates is the most of any operator in North America. On the harness racing side, Penn National is looked at in terms of a national leader in the industry. A number of our representatives, 4 of them in fact, myself included, serve on the United States Trotting Association board. 2 of those on the executive committee, and with the addition of Meadows, Kevin Decker, who runs the racing operations at Meadows, is also on that board. Penn also has a very extensive experience in harness racing operations. We have 4 facilities right now in 4 different jurisdictions. You see that on your chart with Bangor Raceway in Maine, Dayton Raceway, which is a ground-up operation, which was built about 4 years ago, and replaced our former racetrack in Ohio, Raceway Park. Freehold Raceway in New Jersey, which is a joint venture with the Greenwood Group, who are operators here in Pennsylvania of parks, racetrack, and casino. And Plain Ridge Racecourse, which is a fairly new operation in Massachusetts, and we were able to come in there and win the bidding process for a slots license in the state of Massachusetts. As noted before, we've been operating in the state of Pennsylvania since 1972. It's the largest continuous ownership operation in the state of Pennsylvania for the horse racing industry. And as noted before also, we do have harness racing experience in the state with Mohegan Sun, which was part of our operations up until the start of the Gaming Act, where we had to divest from that property. Penn also operates currently 2 off-track betting locations in Pennsylvania, in York and Lancaster, and with the Meadows acquisition, we will add the Harmer Township off-track betting location as well.
Thanks, Chris. Turning to page 13, just to highlight, this is a very, very seamless transaction with really no changes to the licenses or the licensees or the leases involved. The licensees for the Penn National Racecourse, the 2 will stay in place, the Mountain View Thoroughbred Racing Association and Penn National Turf Club. Likewise, the licenses for the Meadows, will remain Washington Trotting Association and Mountain Laurel Racing, Inc., with Penn becoming their ultimate parent. Penn will continue to lease the real estate associated with both properties, the Hollywood Casino property and the Meadows, from GLPI, with no change to the lease itself. And finally, we don't expect any material changes to the racing operations at the Meadows upon change of ownership. Clearly, there's a very favorable impact on Pennsylvania racing through this transaction, as this company, we've talked about the size of it with 43 combined properties across the country. But our database will also include over 5 million known customers. And we have a feeder network into our 2 Las Vegas properties, which will benefit the Meadows. Pinnacle currently does not operate a property in Las Vegas, so we look at this as a significant strategic change in being able to reward their customers with trips to Las Vegas. We believe that there's also opportunities for both tracks to benefit through cross-promotions through Penn's interactive business venture, which could also include ultimately VGT operations at possibly at truck stops in the Commonwealth. And as Chris has alluded to, we believe the Meadows will benefit from Penn's deep experience in horse racing, not just in Pennsylvania, but nationally as well. Finally, we will continue to invest. Those of you who know us will, we continue to invest in our property in Grantville, and we'll continue to do the same thing with the Meadows property. I'll turn it back to Mike.
Thank you, John. Before we conclude in 1 second, as you'd expect, a transaction of this kind it goes before a number of regulators. Just to date, we have 3 of the approvals that we need from Pennsylvania Gaming Control Board, West Virginia Lottery Commission, and the Illinois Gaming Board. We're obviously before you today, and you're before the Mississippi regulators tomorrow. So we'll hopefully have a couple more results, and we're trucking along with all the regulators and answering questions as they come up. So far, no material issues have been discovered. With that, we will happily take any questions that the Commission has.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Questions?
Thank you for your presentation. We certainly know who you are and your operation. But I have just 3, hopefully, short questions. You just said that you expect to invest capital in both properties. Can I get a little bit of an idea of the magnitude of the type of those investments that you're talking about?
Sure, Commissioner. I think for us it always starts with the slot product and making sure we maintain a competitive floor. Obviously, the slot machine is what drives a lot of our business and directly benefits the racing business as well. So we've had a long-standing commitment to reinvest aggressively. Penn is the largest, as I mentioned earlier, the largest operator of slot machines in the country. We're the largest purchaser of slot equipment by extension, and we expect that will continue. Certainly, it's been our way of doing business in Grantville, and it's something we'll look at Meadows. So I think it starts on the slot floor. But an example, in Grantville, we're about to spend several millions of dollars redoing our food court area. We've entered into an agreement with a nationally known celebrity chef who's going to brand those offerings for us, and we should start work this summer. This is at Grantville. We should start work this summer and open that project in November. So there's an example of what we're looking at in Grantville. I think we're going to take a look at everything at the Meadows, the food offerings, the overall floor and product. I will tell you, we don't have any specific plans right now. It's premature to talk about that, I believe, for the Meadows. But I think we'll take our operating template, if you will, that I think has been very successful for us in Grantville and nationally, and take that to the Meadows, whether that's certainly slot product, food and beverage offerings, general refresh of the floor. And I think that's probably the most specific answer I could give you now.
Since this is the Racing Commission, I was wondering whether we could get more specific about the racing portion of the investments you might make.
I understand. I can only talk about the history of Grantville. We've invested over $10 million on the backside, as you're aware, updating the barns and a lot of the facilities on the backside. Again, it's premature for me to talk about examples at the Meadows, but of course, I don't know if there's anything you want to add as far as racing goes.
I don't have a specific number or to say this is a specific thing that we'll be doing. I did have the opportunity actually yesterday to go to the Meadows. First, I've been there in about 4 years. Did a pretty extensive tour with Kevin Decker and both the front side and backside operations. I know they have a good relationship with the MSOA out there.
idea, that you let us know what that is, that would be helpful to us. My next question is that Penn National's been successful in getting Category 4 licenses, two of them, if I read correctly. How do you see that all working with this relationship here, and how it will affect it? From your point of view, I'd like to understand that.
Commissioner, you're correct. We, as you know, bid and were successful on 2 Cat 4 licenses. Those licenses, those locations, we're early in the process. We're still working on the exact locations of them. So can't really tell you because we don't even know where those are going to be. They're going to be operated out of Granville, so the Granville management team will oversee those 2 properties. So there's good continuation of the know-how we have in Pennsylvania, and certainly opportunity to cross-market all the properties since we're running them out of one location. So,
the reason to check is my concern again from the racing point of view, since there's no money coming out of the Category 4s. I'm wondering how you make that work so that there's no negative impact to the racetracks, and also be able to get your return on those. I'm just wondering whether, because that's a concern to me as a commissioner about having a non-horseman's revenue operation, and also the one that gives them revenue. How you make that all work when you own them all. So
I understand. The legislation is what it is.
I'm not commenting on that. I was pointing out the facts.
I understand. I mean, you know, we obviously bid on those locations for defensive purposes, but also offensive purposes. We do think we can grow the business that comes out of those markets that, for the most part, currently goes to Granville. There's certainly going to be a drop-off in business at Granville. There's no doubt. That's why Penn was very opposed to the legislation initially, as you well know. So it's a great question. I think the short answer is there's going to be a drop-off, and that will affect the horsemen, unfortunately, in Granville. How we minimize that, I think, is we're just going to try to grow the business overall as much as possible. We've seen that a lot nationally. I think, you know, most recently, if you look in West Virginia and Maryland with the opening of Maryland Live and National Harbor, both of those properties had significant impacts on our property in Charlestown, West Virginia, impacted the purses very negatively, but overall they grew the market substantially. So the drop-off in Charlestown was a lot less than any Wall Street analyst would have told you before those 2 properties opened. And so we've been able to mitigate that a little bit. The market has grown. But the truth is, Commissioner, there's definitely been a hit in Charlestown, and there will be a hit in Granville, despite, you know, everything we will try to do.
And my last question, Mr. Chairman, is you're certainly qualified to do this, and I'm not commenting on that one, but there's been some negative things happening at National with respect to the horsemen. And what are you doing to correct? I guess it's more to Chris.
Sure.
What are you doing to correct that problem?
I'd love to answer that question, but I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Because that's not been good for our industry, and the commission's been concerned about that. I'm just wondering, this has nothing to do with Meadows, but it has to do with the company itself, and that negative publicity has not been good. I'm just wondering what steps are being taken to try to have that not happen again and to correct the problem.
Sure. Well, no, I'll agree it's not good for Penn National Racehorse, not good for the racing industry in Pennsylvania, it's not good for the racing industry as a whole. I think that we have been fairly aggressive in terms of trying to take steps to weed out individuals who shouldn't be racing at our facility. There are hurdles to doing that, and you know, some of them exist. Coming here and doing under the current statute and regulations, which have stymied us in certain ways, and we certainly want to get the cooperation of everyone possible to be able to alleviate that. But I think this is not a Penn National only issue, and I think the entire industry, we the horsemen, I believe about a year ago in January, all did presentations to the commission, and I think the #1 issue that came up was integrity. And that hasn't changed from our standpoint. I don't think it's changed from anyone's standpoint. So I think it's not just what are we doing. I think it's what can everyone do collectively from that standpoint. So we're not shirking any responsibility. We're certainly doing what's within our power, what's within our domain, so to speak, to address those matters. And we certainly hope everybody else that's involved will do the same thing.
Mr. Chairman, I do have one question, probably for Chris more than anyone else. Are there any changes that you foresee with the existing contracts with racing vendors and with your tow providers?
At this time, no. Right now, we do still have to go through a due diligence period on that, but in the short term, we're not expecting any changes, nor can we, right now, with the transaction, the way it is, we can't influence any of those at this point. But we'll certainly look, as we get more integrated, to take a look at agreements, and if there is possibilities of rolling them into our existing ones that could be beneficial for everyone, we'll certainly look at that. But in the short term, we're not expecting any material changes.
Would you all provide the commission when and if you do make those modifications, if the Director of Licensing and legal can get those, that we'd appreciate it.
Sure, no problem.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have anything else.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? John, if I could ask on slide 13, the GL with PI, I know it's several public traded company, but where does that fit in the transaction structure on page 8?
Yep, so I'll answer that one. So they're not on the structure, but so, as you mentioned, they're separate company. But the leases are with the entities P&K Development 33 LLC on the on the Pinnacle side, and Penn Tenant LLC on the Penn side. So for Penn, we have one master lease with GLPI that covers all the properties that we operate under the lease. Pinnacle also has a master lease. However, when they bought Meadows, it was in a separate transaction, and as a result, they had a separate standalone lease for the Meadows. They made the decision not to roll that into the master lease, but maintain a separate standalone lease for the Meadows. And in connection with this transaction, we are continuing that. So we would just be, by virtue of the transaction, assuming that lease and leaving it intact.
Questions, comments? I want to say thank you to you for giving some insight to who made the first move. First question. To the appreciation of what's happening around the United States and influences what you're doing as well. But just to underscore the interest in the live racing, to say is important to us. There's a larger premise which we've made legislative moves that we've made over the years as well to support that. So as you move forward, once the commission sort of those ask your sensitivity to it, not that you're not, but just to keep underscoring that point. Okay? Yeah. So I have Kim Hankins would like to offer us